The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as 23-year-old Lieutenant James Morrison adjusted his crisp uniform one final time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cool London air, but from the weight of responsibility that pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Today marked his first day as the newly appointed ceremonial officer overseeing the changing of the Guard, a position that countless military officers dreamed of achieving. James had worked tirelessly for this moment throughout his military career. Born in a modest household in Manchester, he was the son of a factory worker and a school teacher who had instilled in him the values of hard work, discipline, and respect for tradition. His father, Robert Morrison, had served briefly in the military during his youth, but never achieved the ranks or recognition that his son now commanded. His mother, Margaret, had always encouraged James to pursue his dreams, even when those dreams seemed impossibly distant from their working-class reality. The young lieutenant's journey to this prestigious position had been marked by excellence at every turn. He had graduated top of his class from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, excelled in various military exercises, and demonstrated exceptional leadership qualities that caught the attention of his superior officers. His commanding officers had noted his attention to detail, his unwavering commitment to protocol, and, most importantly, his deep respect for the traditions that made the British military renowned worldwide. As James walked through the palace grounds that morning, he couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the historical significance of his surroundings. The same paths had been walked by countless officers before him, each carrying the responsibility of maintaining the dignity and precision that the royal ceremonies demanded. The weight of tradition seemed to echo in every footstep, reminding him that he was now part of something much larger than himself. The changing of the Guard ceremony was more than just a tourist attraction. It was a living symbol of British heritage, discipline, and military excellence. Every movement, every command, every gesture had been refined over generations to create a spectacle that represented the very best of military tradition. The Guards who participated in this ceremony were among the elite, chosen not only for their military skills, but also for their ability to maintain the highest standards of presentation and conduct under the scrutiny of thousands of visitors and dignitaries. James had spent weeks studying every aspect of the ceremony, memorizing the precise timing, the exact positions, and the specific commands that would ensure the event proceeded flawlessly. He had observed veteran officers conducting the ceremony, taking careful notes, and asking detailed questions about even the smallest elements of the protocol. His preparation had been thorough and methodical, leaving nothing to chance. The Guards under his command were equally impressive specimens of military bearing. Each man had been selected through a rigorous process that evaluated not only their military competence, but also their ability to maintain the stoic composure required for ceremonial duties. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the cream of the crop, individuals who understood that their role extended far beyond simple military service to encompass the preservation of national pride and tradition. Sergeant William Hayes, a veteran of 15 years in the Queen's Guard, had been assigned to assist James during his first weeks in the position. Hayes was a man of few words but immense experience, having overseen hundreds of ceremonies and witnessed the evolution of numerous young officers as they adapted to the unique demands of ceremonial duty. His weathered face bore the marks of years spent standing at attention in all weather conditions, and his eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who had mastered his craft through decades of dedicated service. The relationship between Hayes and the Guards was built on mutual respect and understanding. He knew each man's strengths and weaknesses, understood their backgrounds and motivations, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was amiss in the ranks. The Guards, in turn, looked to Hayes as both a mentor and a guardian of the standards they all strived to maintain. As the morning progressed, James conducted his final inspection of the Guards, checking every detail of their uniforms, equipment, and bearing. The famous red tunics were pristine, each button polished to perfection, and the tall bearskin hats sat at precisely the correct angle. The Guards' boots gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the morning light and demonstrating the hours of careful preparation that had gone into their presentation. The weapons carried by the Guards were equally impressive, maintained to museum-quality standards that reflected the ceremonial nature of their role while still serving as functional military equipment. Each rifle was inspected thoroughly, ensuring that every component met the exacting standards required for the ceremony. The bayonets attached to these weapons were polished to a brilliant shine, their edges sharp enough to serve their intended purpose if ever called upon to do so. James felt a surge of pride as he observed the men under his command. They represented the very best of British military tradition, embodying values of courage, discipline, and dedication that had been passed down through generations of soldiers. Their commitment to excellence was evident in every aspect of their preparation and presentation, from the way they held themselves at attention to the precision with which they executed even the smallest movements. The crowds were already beginning to gather in the courtyard, tourists and locals alike drawn by the spectacle they knew was about to unfold. Among them were families with children who pointed excitedly at the guards, elderly visitors who remembered similar ceremonies from decades past, and international tourists who had traveled thousands of miles to witness this uniquely British tradition. The anticipation in the air was palpable, creating an atmosphere of expectation that added to the significance of the moment. James checked his watch, noting that the ceremony would begin in precisely 30 minutes. Everything was proceeding according to plan, with each element falling into place exactly as rehearsed. The timing was critical, as the ceremony was scheduled to coordinate with other military movements and royal activities throughout the day. Any deviation from the established schedule would create a cascade of complications that could affect multiple events and disappoint thousands of spectators. The young officer took a moment to collect his thoughts, drawing upon the training and preparation that had brought him to this point. He thought of his family back in Manchester, who would be watching the ceremony on television, their faces beaming with pride as they saw their son commanding one of the most prestigious military ceremonies in the world. He thought of his military academy instructors, who had instilled in him the principles of leadership and excellence that now guided his every decision. As the final minutes before the ceremony ticked away, James felt a calm confidence settling over him. He had prepared thoroughly, his men were ready, and the stage was set for what he hoped would be a flawless execution of one of Britain's most cherished traditions. Little did he know that the events about to unfold would challenge everything he thought he knew about military protocol and human nature, creating a moment that would be remembered long after the crowds had dispersed and the guards had returned to their quarters. The ceremony was about to begin, and, with it, a series of events that would test the very foundations of military discipline and reveal the complex emotions that lay beneath the stoic exterior of the Royal Guards. What started as a routine changing of the guard would soon become something much more profound, touching the hearts of everyone present and reminding them all that behind the pageantry and tradition were real human beings with their own stories, struggles, and moments of unexpected vulnerability. The ceremony commenced with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next as the guards began their carefully choreographed routine. Lieutenant James Morrison stood at his designated position, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard as he issued the traditional commands that had echoed through these same stones for generations. The tourists pressed closer to the barriers, cameras clicking, and phones recording as they captured what they believed would be a typical display of British military pageantry. Among the crowd stood an elderly man whose presence seemed somehow different from the casual observers surrounding him. Colonel Arthur Pemberton, now 78 years old, leaned heavily on a walking stick, his civilian clothes unable to completely conceal the military bearing that decades of service had etched into his very posture. His gray eyes, though dimmed by age, still held the sharp intelligence and commanding presence that had once made him a legend within the regiment. Pemberton had not come to the palace as a tourist. He had served with distinction for over 40 years, rising through the ranks to become one of the most respected officers in the British Army. His chest, though now covered by a simple wool coat, had once borne ribbons representing service in conflicts across multiple continents, acts of valor that had earned him recognition from the highest levels of government, and leadership achievements that had shaped the careers of countless soldiers under his command. The old colonel's connection to the Queen's Guard ran deeper than mere professional association. He had served as commanding officer of the regiment for nearly a decade, during which time he had personally overseen the training and development of hundreds of guards who had gone on to serve with distinction in ceremonial duties and combat operations alike. His influence on the unit's traditions, standards, and culture could not be overstated. In many ways, the excellence that the current guards displayed was a direct reflection of the foundation he had helped establish years earlier. Beside Pemberton stood his daughter, Sarah, a middle-aged woman whose own military service had been cut short by family obligations, but whose understanding of military culture remained profound. She had accompanied her father on this visit to London, concerned about his declining health and wanting to ensure he could witness one final changing of the guard ceremony before his condition deteriorated further. Sarah understood the deep emotional significance this moment held for her father, though she had not anticipated the intensity of the emotions that would soon unfold. As the ceremony progressed, James continued to issue commands with growing confidence. The guards responded with mechanical precision, their movements synchronized to perfection as they executed the complex maneuvers that formed the heart of the ceremony. The crowd watched in fascination as the old guard was relieved by the new, each step performed with the dignity and precision that had made this ceremony famous throughout the world. However, among the guards participating in the ceremony, one figure stood out to those who knew how to look for the subtle signs of military experience and dedication. Guard Thomas Mitchell, a 25-year-old soldier from Birmingham, carried himself with the particular bearing of someone who had seen combat service beyond the ceremonial duties that now occupied his time. His record spoke of deployments to Afghanistan, where he had served with distinction in some of the most challenging conditions faced by British forces in recent decades. Mitchell's path to the Queen's Guard had been unconventional. Unlike many of his colleagues who had been selected for ceremonial duties based primarily on their physical appearance and drill proficiency, Mitchell had earned his position through exceptional service in combat operations. His superiors had recognized that his experience and maturity would add depth to the ceremonial unit, bringing the perspective of someone who understood the serious military heritage that the pageantry represented. The young guard's service in Afghanistan had been marked by several incidents that demonstrated his courage under fire and his commitment to his fellow soldiers. During one particularly intense engagement, Mitchell had risked his own safety to evacuate wounded comrades from a position under heavy enemy fire, actions that had earned him a commendation for bravery and the deep respect of his unit. His transition to ceremonial duties had been seen by his commanders as a well-deserved opportunity to serve in a role that honored both his service record and his potential for continued military excellence. As the ceremony reached its midpoint, Colonel Pemberton's trained eye began to pick out details that the casual observers around him would never notice. He recognized the quality of the drill, the precision of the movements, and the professional competence of the young lieutenant directing the proceedings. More importantly, he began to recognize something familiar in the bearing and movement of Guard Mitchell, though he could not immediately place what it was that seemed so recognizable about the young soldier. The recognition came slowly, like dawn breaking over a familiar landscape. Pemberton's mind, still sharp despite his physical frailty, began to process the details of Mitchell's appearance and bearing, comparing them to memories that stretched back through decades of military service. There was something about the guard's posture, the way he held his weapon, and the subtle confidence in his movements that triggered a cascade of recollections from the colonel's long career. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place with startling clarity. Colonel Pemberton realized that he was looking at someone whose military service had intersected with his own in ways that went far beyond the current ceremonial setting. The connection was not immediately obvious, hidden beneath the formal uniform and ceremonial context, but, once recognized, it became impossible to ignore. The old colonel felt his heart rate increase as the implications of this recognition began to unfold in his mind. The crowd around Pemberton continued to watch the ceremony with casual interest, unaware of the profound personal drama that was beginning to develop just meters away from them. Children pointed at the colorful uniforms, adults took photographs, and tour guides provided commentary about the historical significance of the ritual they were witnessing. None of them could have imagined that they were about to witness something far more meaningful than the scripted pageantry they had come to observe. As Lieutenant Morrison continued to direct the ceremony, his attention remained focused on ensuring that every element proceeded according to protocol. He was aware of the crowd's presence, but trained to maintain his concentration on the military aspects of the event regardless of external distractions. His commands rang out clearly, each one delivered with the authority and precision that his training had instilled in him. The guards themselves maintained their stoic expressions, their faces revealing nothing of their individual thoughts or feelings as they executed their assigned roles. This emotional control was part of their training, a deliberate cultivation of the ability to maintain professional composure regardless of personal circumstances or external pressures. They had been taught that their role was to embody the stability and reliability of the institution they represented, rising above individual concerns to serve something larger than themselves. However, beneath this carefully maintained exterior, Guard Mitchell was experiencing his own internal recognition. His peripheral vision had caught sight of the elderly man in the crowd, and something about the figure seemed familiar despite the civilian clothes and the passage of years. Mitchell's training prevented him from breaking his ceremonial posture to investigate further, but his mind began working through possibilities, trying to place where he might have encountered this person before. The connection that both men were beginning to recognize stretched back to a dusty forward operating base in Helmand Province, where their paths had crossed under circumstances far removed from the pageantry of Buckingham Palace. It had been a brief encounter, lasting only a few hours, but one that had left an indelible impression on both participants for very different reasons. The formal military hierarchy that had separated them then was about to be bridged by a moment of human recognition that would transcend rank, protocol, and the carefully scripted nature of the ceremony unfolding around them. As the ceremony approached its climactic moment, neither man could have predicted how profoundly the next few minutes would affect not only themselves, but everyone present in the courtyard. The stage was set for an encounter that would challenge the boundaries between military formality and human emotion, creating a moment that would resonate far beyond the confines of the ceremonial protocol that had brought them together. The memory that was slowly crystallizing in both men's minds traced back to a scorching afternoon in Afghanistan's Helmand Province, 3 years earlier. Forward Operating Base Edinburgh had been a small outpost situated in one of the most dangerous regions of the country, where British forces maintained a precarious foothold against determined insurgent forces. The base served as a crucial link in the supply chain that kept larger military installations functioning, but its isolated location made it a frequent target for enemy attacks. On that particular day in August, Colonel Pemberton had been conducting one of his regular inspection tours of forward positions, a practice that had earned him tremendous respect among frontline troops who were accustomed to senior officers who preferred to remain safely behind the lines. Pemberton's philosophy of leadership demanded that he personally assess the conditions under which his soldiers operated, sharing their risks and understanding their challenges firsthand rather than relying solely on written reports and briefings. The helicopter carrying Pemberton and his small staff had been forced to make an emergency landing at FOB Edinburgh due to mechanical problems that grounded the aircraft for several hours while repairs were attempted. What should have been a brief refueling stop became an extended visit that allowed the colonel to interact extensively with the soldiers stationed at the remote outpost, including a young private named Thomas Mitchell, who was serving his first deployment in a combat zone. Mitchell had been part of a small unit tasked with maintaining perimeter security around the base, a responsibility that required constant vigilance and nerves of steel given the frequency of insurgent attacks in the area. Despite being only 22 years old at the time, Mitchell had already distinguished himself among his peers through his reliability under pressure and his willingness to volunteer for the most dangerous assignments. His squad leader had noted that the young private seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of combat tactics that was unusual for someone with limited experience. During the colonel's unexpected extended stay at the base, a situation had developed that would forever link the two men in ways that neither could have anticipated at the time. Intelligence reports had indicated that a convoy carrying medical supplies to a nearby village was likely to be ambushed along the only accessible route through the mountains. The convoy's mission was critical, as the medical supplies were desperately needed to treat civilians injured in recent fighting, but the risk of attack was considered extremely high. The base commander had been faced with an impossible choice: allow the convoy to proceed without adequate escort and risk losing both the supplies and the lives of the convoy personnel, or cancel the mission and condemn the injured civilians to suffer without essential medical care. The debate among the officers had been intense, with valid arguments on both sides and no clear solution that would eliminate the inherent dangers of either option. It was during this crisis that Private Mitchell had approached his squad leader with a proposal that demonstrated both remarkable tactical insight and extraordinary personal courage. Mitchell had studied the terrain maps extensively and identified an alternative route that, while longer and more difficult, would allow a small team to reach the village ahead of the convoy and establish a security perimeter that could provide early warning of any ambush attempts. The plan was audacious and dangerous, requiring a small team to traverse hostile territory on foot, carrying heavy equipment, and operating without the support that would be available to a larger force. The likelihood of success was uncertain, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic for both the mission and the soldiers involved. However, Mitchell argued convincingly that the element of surprise and the unexpected nature of the approach might provide the tactical advantage necessary to ensure the convoy's safe passage. When Colonel Pemberton was briefed on Mitchell's proposal, he had been struck not only by the tactical sophistication of the plan but also by the moral courage displayed by a young soldier who was volunteering to undertake extreme personal risk for the benefit of people he had never met. The colonel had seen many acts of bravery during his long career, but there was something particularly compelling about Mitchell's combination of tactical intelligence and selfless dedication to the mission. After careful consideration of the risks and alternatives, Pemberton had approved the mission, but with the stipulation that he would personally oversee the planning and coordination to ensure that every possible precaution was taken to maximize the team's chances of success. This decision had surprised many of the officers present, as it was highly unusual for a colonel to involve himself so directly in the tactical details of such a small-scale operation. The mission that followed had tested every aspect of Mitchell's skills and character. The small team had successfully navigated the treacherous mountain terrain, established their observation posts without detection, and provided the critical intelligence that allowed the convoy to complete its mission safely. However, during the operation, the team had come under intense enemy fire that had threatened to overwhelm their position and compromise the entire mission. It was Mitchell's quick thinking and decisive action under fire that had turned the tide of the engagement. Using the terrain to his advantage, he had managed to outflank the enemy position and provide covering fire that allowed his teammates to withdraw to safety while maintaining the security perimeter around the convoy route. His actions had not only saved the lives of his fellow soldiers, but had also ensured that the medical supplies reached their intended destination. Colonel Pemberton had witnessed Mitchell's performance through binoculars from the command post, and what he had seen had left an indelible impression on him. The young private's tactical skills, courage under fire, and unwavering commitment to the mission had represented everything that the colonel valued most in a soldier. More importantly, Mitchell's willingness to risk everything for the welfare of civilians he would never meet had demonstrated a moral character that transcended military training and spoke to something fundamental about human nature. In the immediate aftermath of the successful mission, Pemberton had sought out Mitchell personally to express his appreciation for the young soldier's actions. The brief conversation that had followed was conducted in the utilitarian surroundings of the base's mess tent, with the sounds of helicopter rotors and distant artillery providing a harsh backdrop to their exchange. The colonel had been struck by Mitchell's humility and his apparent surprise that his actions were considered particularly noteworthy. During their conversation, Pemberton had learned about Mitchell's background, his motivations for military service, and his aspirations for the future. The young soldier had spoken about his family in Birmingham, his desire to make a meaningful contribution to something larger than himself, and his growing understanding of the complex challenges facing British forces in Afghanistan. The colonel had been impressed by Mitchell's maturity and his thoughtful approach to the moral and tactical questions raised by their current situation. As their conversation had drawn to a close, Pemberton had done something that was both highly unusual and deeply personal. He had removed his own colonel's insignia, a pair of crown and pip badges that he had worn throughout his long career, and presented them to Mitchell as a token of his respect and appreciation. The gesture had been witnessed by several other soldiers, creating a moment that would become part of the folklore of FOB Edinburgh and a source of inspiration for the troops stationed there. Now, 3 years later, as both men stood in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, the memory of that encounter was beginning to surface with startling clarity. The formal military ceremony unfolding around them seemed to fade into the background as the recognition dawned that their paths were crossing once again under circumstances that neither could have imagined during their brief encounter in the dust and danger of Afghanistan. As the ceremony reached its crescendo, the moment of recognition became mutual and undeniable. Guard Mitchell, despite his rigid training in maintaining ceremonial composure, felt his carefully controlled exterior beginning to crack as he finally identified the elderly man in the crowd. The realization that Colonel Pemberton was standing just meters away sent a flood of emotions coursing through him that threatened to overwhelm the professional discipline that had been drilled into him through years of military service. The colonel's insignia that Mitchell had been given that day in Afghanistan remained one of his most treasured possessions, carefully preserved in his personal quarters as a reminder of a moment that had fundamentally changed his understanding of military service and personal honor. The encounter with Pemberton had become a defining experience in Mitchell's military career, inspiring him to pursue excellence not just in combat operations but in every aspect of his service, ultimately leading to his selection for the prestigious ceremonial duties he now performed. For Colonel Pemberton, the recognition was equally profound. Despite his advanced age and declining health, his memory of that day in Afghanistan remained crystal clear, and seeing Mitchell now, transformed from a young private into a member of the elite Queen's Guard, filled him with a complex mixture of pride, nostalgia, and deep emotional satisfaction. The old colonel realized that he was witnessing the culmination of a young soldier's journey from the battlefield to one of the highest honors in British military service. Lieutenant Morrison, focused on the precise execution of the ceremony, initially remained unaware of the silent drama unfolding within his ranks. His attention was directed toward ensuring that every movement, every command, and every transition proceeded according to the exacting standards required for such a public display of military excellence. However, his trained eye began to detect subtle changes in Guard Mitchell's demeanor that suggested something was affecting the usually impeccable composure of one of his most reliable soldiers. The crowd of tourists and onlookers continued to watch the ceremony with casual interest, their cameras capturing what they assumed was simply another routine changing of the guard. None of them could have imagined that they were about to witness a moment of human connection that would transcend the formal boundaries of military protocol and reveal the profound personal bonds that could develop between soldiers who had served together in the crucible of combat. As the ceremony approached its conclusion, the emotional tension that had been building within both Mitchell and Pemberton reached a breaking point. The formal constraints of the ceremonial setting seemed increasingly inadequate to contain the significance of their unexpected reunion, creating a conflict between military discipline and human emotion that would soon demand resolution. It was at this critical moment that Colonel Pemberton made a decision that would shock everyone present and create a moment that would be remembered long after the ceremony had ended. Drawing upon reserves of strength that seemed to defy his physical frailty, the elderly colonel began to move slowly but deliberately toward the ceremonial area where the guards were positioned. His daughter Sarah, initially confused by her father's sudden movement, quickly realized what was happening and moved to support him as he made his way forward. The crowd began to murmur as they noticed the elderly man's approach, uncertain whether this was part of the ceremony or an unexpected disruption. Security personnel began to take notice, preparing to intervene if necessary to maintain the integrity of the ceremonial proceedings. However, something about Pemberton's bearing and obvious military background caused them to hesitate, sensing that this was not a typical tourist disruption, but something far more significant. Lieutenant Morrison's attention was immediately drawn to the approaching figure, his military training alerting him to the potential disruption of the ceremony, while his instincts as an officer suggested that this situation required careful handling rather than immediate intervention. The lieutenant found himself faced with a dilemma that his training had not specifically prepared him for: how to maintain ceremonial protocol while respecting what was clearly a moment of profound personal significance. As Pemberton drew closer to the guard formation, Mitchell's internal struggle became more intense. Every aspect of his training commanded him to maintain his position and composure regardless of external circumstances, but the emotional impact of seeing his former colonel, clearly aged and frail, threatened to override his professional discipline. The young guard's hands began to tremble almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the tremendous internal conflict he was experiencing. The colonel's approach had not gone unnoticed by the other guards, who maintained their ceremonial positions while using their peripheral vision to monitor the developing situation. These were experienced soldiers who understood that unusual circumstances sometimes arose during public ceremonies, and their training had prepared them to adapt while maintaining the dignity and precision that the ceremony demanded. Sergeant Hayes, positioned where he could observe both the guards and the approaching figure, immediately recognized the significance of what was unfolding. His years of experience had given him an intuitive understanding of the complex dynamics that could develop between soldiers, and he could see that this was not a random disruption, but a moment of genuine military significance that deserved respect and careful handling. When Colonel Pemberton finally reached a position directly in front of Guard Mitchell, the entire courtyard seemed to fall silent despite the continued presence of hundreds of spectators. The old colonel's eyes met those of the young guard, and, in that moment, 3 years of separation and the vast difference in their current circumstances seemed to dissolve, leaving only the fundamental connection between two soldiers who had shared a moment of extraordinary courage and mutual respect. What happened next would shock Lieutenant Morrison, astound the watching crowd, and create a moment that would challenge every assumption about military protocol and the human emotions that lay beneath the surface of ceremonial pageantry. The carefully scripted nature of the ceremony was about to give way to something far more powerful and authentic, demonstrating that even the most formal military traditions could not completely contain the profound bonds that developed between soldiers who had served together in the most challenging circumstances. Colonel Pemberton, drawing upon reserves of strength that seemed to come from deep within his military heritage, slowly raised his hand in a salute that carried with it all the respect, gratitude, and admiration that he felt for the young soldiers standing before him. The gesture was not part of any ceremonial protocol, but it carried a weight and significance that transcended any written regulation or formal procedure. The impact of this unexpected salute rippled through the assembled crowd like a shock wave, but its most profound effect was on Guard Mitchell himself, who found himself facing the most challenging moment of his entire military career as he struggled to respond appropriately to this unprecedented situation while maintaining the professional composure that his position demanded. The moment that followed Colonel Pemberton's unexpected salute seemed to stretch into eternity, suspended between the rigid demands of military protocol and the irresistible pull of human emotion. Guard Mitchell stood frozen in his ceremonial position, every fiber of his being torn between his training and his heart as he processed the profound significance of what was happening before him. Lieutenant Morrison watched in amazement as the situation unfolded, his mind racing through the protocols and regulations that govern ceremonial duties, while simultaneously recognizing that he was witnessing something that transcended any written manual or formal procedure. The young officer realized that his response to this moment would define not only his own character, but also set a precedent for how the military could honor the bonds between soldiers while maintaining the dignity and discipline that ceremonial duties required. The crowd of spectators had fallen into an unexpected silence, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary even if they could not fully understand its significance. Cameras that had been clicking constantly throughout the ceremony were now held motionless as people instinctively recognized that this was a moment that demanded respect rather than casual documentation. Children who had been chattering excitedly about the colorful uniforms now stood quietly beside their parents, somehow understanding that something important was happening. For what seemed like an eternity, Mitchell remained at rigid attention, his training warring with his emotions as he struggled to determine the appropriate response to his former colonel's salute. The internal conflict was visible in the slight tremor that ran through his body and the subtle tightening of his grip on his ceremonial rifle. Every regulation he had ever learned demanded that he maintain his position and composure, but every instinct of respect and gratitude pulled him toward acknowledging the man who had recognized his service in Afghanistan. Sergeant Hayes, observing the situation with the wisdom of his years of experience, recognized that this was a moment that called for flexibility within the framework of military tradition rather than rigid adherence to ceremonial protocol. He had seen enough of military service to understand that true discipline sometimes meant knowing when to adapt formal procedures to honor the deeper principles they were meant to serve. It was then that something extraordinary happened. As if responding to some unspoken communication that passed between all the military personnel present, a subtle shift began to occur in the atmosphere of the ceremony. Lieutenant Morrison, displaying the kind of leadership that his training at Sandhurst had been designed to develop, made a decision that would be remembered as one of the finest moments of his career. Speaking in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard but maintained the dignity appropriate to the setting, Lieutenant Morrison called out a command that was not part of any written ceremonial protocol. "Guard Mitchell, you are hereby granted permission to return the colonel's salute." The effect of these words was immediate and profound. Mitchell's internal conflict was resolved in an instant as his superior officer had provided him with the authorization he needed to follow his heart while maintaining his military bearing. With movements that were both precise and deeply emotional, Guard Mitchell brought his rifle to the present arms position and then, breaking from ceremonial formation for the first time in his career with the Queen's Guard, rendered a perfect military salute to Colonel Pemberton. The sight of the young guard's salute, delivered with all the precision and respect that his military training had instilled in him proved too much for the elderly colonel's emotional composure. Tears began to stream down Pemberton's weathered cheeks as he held his salute, his body trembling with the effort of maintaining the position while his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. The gesture represented not just an acknowledgement of their shared experience in Afghanistan, but a recognition of the journey that had brought Mitchell from a young private on a dangerous mission to a member of one of Britain's most elite ceremonial units. Sarah Pemberton, standing beside her father and supporting his frail frame, found herself crying as well, though she had only recently learned the full story of her father's encounter with Mitchell in Afghanistan. Seeing her father's emotional response to this unexpected reunion helped her understand the profound impact that military service could have on the bonds between soldiers, transcending rank and circumstance to create connections that lasted a lifetime. The other guards in the formation, while maintaining their ceremonial positions, were deeply moved by the exchange they were witnessing. Many of them had their own experiences of combat service and could understand the significance of the moment even if they were not familiar with the specific details of Mitchell and Pemberton's shared history. The ceremony had become something far more meaningful than a routine changing of the guard. It had become a testament to the enduring bonds of military brotherhood. Lieutenant Morrison, having made the decision to allow the salute exchange, felt a profound sense of satisfaction as he witnessed its impact. His choice to prioritize the human element over strict protocol had been vindicated by the dignity and respect with which both Mitchell and Pemberton had conducted themselves. The young officer realized that true military leadership sometimes meant having the wisdom to recognize when flexibility served honor better than rigidity. As the salutes were finally lowered, Colonel Pemberton managed to speak, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard with surprising strength. "Well done, soldier. Your service honors us all." The simple words carried with them all the respect and admiration that the old colonel felt for the young guard who had demonstrated such courage in Afghanistan and such dedication in his subsequent service. Mitchell, his voice thick with emotion but still maintaining military bearing, replied, "Thank you, sir. It was an honor to serve under your command." The exchange was brief but profound, encapsulating years of mutual respect and the deep satisfaction that both men felt at their unexpected reunion. The crowd that had witnessed this extraordinary exchange burst into spontaneous applause, their earlier silence giving way to an appreciation for what they had seen even if they did not fully understand its military significance. The ceremony that had begun as a routine tourist attraction had been transformed into something that touched the hearts of everyone present, demonstrating the human emotions that lay beneath the surface of military pageantry. As the formal ceremony resumed and concluded, the impact of what had occurred continued to resonate throughout the palace grounds. Word of the incident spread quickly among the military personnel present, and, within hours, accounts of the exchange between Mitchell and Pemberton were being shared throughout the regiment and beyond. In the days that followed, the story of the colonel's salute and the guard's response became part of the regiment's folklore, told and retold as an example of how military traditions could accommodate and honor the profound bonds between soldiers while maintaining the dignity and discipline that ceremonial duties required. Lieutenant Morrison's decision to authorize Mitchell's return salute was praised by his superiors as an example of flexible leadership that honored both protocol and the deeper principles it was meant to serve. For Colonel Pemberton, the encounter provided a sense of closure and satisfaction that he had not expected to find. Seeing Mitchell's transformation from a young private to a member of the Queen's Guard confirmed his belief in the potential of individual soldiers to grow and excel when given the opportunity and encouragement to do so. The meeting had also demonstrated that the values and traditions he had spent his career defending continued to thrive in the next generation of military personnel. Guard Mitchell returned to his duties with renewed pride and purpose, knowing that his service had been recognized by someone whose opinion he valued above all others. The colonel's salute had validated not only his actions in Afghanistan, but also his continued dedication to military excellence in his ceremonial role. The encounter had reminded him why he had chosen military service and reinforced his commitment to upholding the traditions and standards of the regiment. The incident at Buckingham Palace became more than just a memorable moment for those who witnessed it. It became a powerful reminder that behind the pageantry and protocol of military ceremonies were real human beings whose service and sacrifice deserved recognition and respect. The spontaneous exchange of salutes had transcended the formal boundaries of the ceremony to create a moment of genuine human connection that honored both individual courage and the timeless values of military service. Years later, both men would continue to remember that moment in the palace courtyard as one of the defining experiences of their respective military careers, a testament to the enduring bonds that can develop between soldiers and the power of mutual respect to transcend the barriers of rank, time, and circumstance.